and thank you very much, Bill, for the invitation, and thank you for coming. If you read the news about Haiti, you'll know that a new genre has developed in the last couple of years, which has the generic title Haiti after the earthquake, or X years after the earthquake, and then there's usually a subtitle, something like Taking Stock, or Still Waiting for Reconstruction, or Emerging from the Ruins, or something like that. That puts a spin that's either more or less positive. And I should say right away that I'm not myself in a position to write one of those. I haven't been to Haiti for several years now. I think the genre itself is a bit problematic. On the other hand, of course, it's a logical place in which to take stock what's happened to Haiti in the last 3 years since the earthquake. And if you read through a sampling of these pieces, and they're all over the press, you can learn a certain number of things, both about what's happened, but maybe more importantly about how the press and people with power, governments and so on, formulate the issues, how they see them. And you would learn, so I'll run through a few of these things, and inevitably it's going to take a few minutes to do so, and then I want to try and reframe the problem and try and see it in a different kind of way. Overall, I'm going to talk for about 40 minutes or so, which should leave a pretty good amount of time for questions. And on balance, the situation is about as catastrophically bad as you can imagine. If you follow the press, this won't be news to you. If you don't, you need to really try and widen your imagination unless you've seen something comparable, and you'd have to look pretty hard to find something comparable. The situation really, it defies hyperbole. You sort of run out of terms with which to describe it. But if you read through sampling these things in the last month or so, you learn that there have been a few success stories. So a lot of the rubble has been cleared now. A few schools have been built or are being planned. Some roads have been built. There's a shiny new industrial park on the north coast that may one day employ up to 20,000 people making t-shirts and jeans and so on at a couple of bucks a day. You'll know that there have been some new hotels built. There's one that has the surreal title, if you know something about Haiti's history, called the Royal Oasis, which is a big fancy place in Port-au-Prince. A new airport terminal, a few things like this. Okay, that's the plus side. You could expand it a bit, you could find a few anecdotes. But after that, the good news runs out pretty fast. You'd also learn a whole overwhelming series of statistics about how poor Haiti is and remains and has been for some time. More than half the population living on pennies a day. I mean, people say they put out a number like 55 cents, 44 cents a family, $1 a day. These numbers don't mean very much. People generally don't have money at all. It's an informal economy, largely barter-driven, or families that hold themselves together somehow or other. The main source of cash for most people in that position are remittances that are sent back from members of their family working abroad in some of the most highly exploited jobs in the world. You'd also know that the position of people in this poverty bracket, which is to say most of the population, has got much worse in the last few years. Neoliberal policies have driven the cost of living up. It's become the single biggest source of protest against la vie chère, people say, for years now. And since the earthquake, fundamental things like the cost of rent, the cost of quite a lot of foodstuffs and so on have got much higher. The immediate source of money for a lot of people who are out of work, donor-driven cash for work job schemes like paying people to pick up litter or clear away rubble or maybe do a little bit of ad hoc construction. Most of those projects are finished and have left nothing behind. Again, as a pattern that goes back for years. And unemployment is now really a harrowing thing. It's always been high, but it's at least 70%, depending on how you calculate it. The big economic story is that, well, there's been a little bit of investment in low-wage jobs. That's Haiti's great trump card, its great comparative advantage. Paying typically $3 a day, sometimes up to $5 a day, in a couple of big industrial parks. There's one on the border of the Dominican Republic, there's another now, this new one called Caracol on the north coast, there's one on the northern edge of Port-au-Prince. If you get one, you're lucky, but there's no way you can support a family on that salary. Has anybody here been to Haiti out of curiosity? First of all, I really encourage you to go. It's expensive to get there, but it's a very interesting country to visit, needless to say, and it's a very easy country to visit in a lot of ways, so don't be put off by some of the stories you might hear about it. But one of the things that's striking about it is it's actually very expensive. If you don't have money and you have a family and you're networked with people who have a plot of land here or know somebody over there or have a way into some kind of piece of the action somewhere or other, you can survive, and people are amazingly good at surviving on nothing or on peanuts. But if you have to pay for anything, it's very tricky. Everything is imported, or most everything is imported. More than half the food, probably 70% of the food is imported. Any kind of consumer good, except if it's not a t-shirt, is largely imported, a few exceptions. So it's actually, it's very expensive. And there's no way on earth that you can support a family on $3 a day in Haiti. So it's a serious situation. You'd learn, probably if you read some of these accounts that I'm talking about, you'd learn some illustrations or examples of what it's like to try and raise a family in this kind of situation. What happens when people get sick, for example. What happens if you run into trouble with the law. All these things are, again, kind of defy description. You learn that the country is still under foreign occupation, that the UN has this huge occupation force called a stabilization force, about 7,000 or 8,000 troops, almost as many police, and that there's a big investment in different forms of security provision, largely private, very complicated now. There's all sorts of private security agencies working with different NGOs and so on. The number of people with guns now is probably 20,000, 30,000. Nobody really seems to have a good sense of it. And this, despite the fact that, although again, contrary to images you might have of Haiti, if you just have an image of it as being this kind of strangely dark, superstitious, crime-ridden, chronically unstable place, it's actually the contrary is the truth. The murder rate, for example, in Haiti is about a quarter of what it is in Jamaica, and about a fifth or a sixth of what it is in some big American cities like New Orleans, for example. Crime is actually very low in Haiti. It's a very well self-policed society, in fact, for reasons that are actually very easily understood if you know something about the history. And there is no need for this stabilization force, which is very widely resented. In fact, there's very rarely is it even described why it's there in the first place, so I'll come back to that. Why does the UN have a big stabilization, often called peacekeeping force? But there's been no war in Haiti. What is it doing there? Why is it there? Why is it spending, by the way, about $700 million a year? That is an amount roughly equal to the entire national budget in Haiti. In fact, it's twice the amount of the annual budget that the last truly popular president of the country, Aristide, had when he was in charge. And if you took that, simply all that it does, by the way, is pay for the troops. That's it. There's no mandate for anything else, nothing to do with development or reconstruction or anything. It simply maintains a garrison of foreign troops, most of whom can't communicate with the population, sometimes to the point of just comical situations. I mean, last time I was there, I got a lift from some guys from China, for example, who couldn't speak French, let alone Creole, and their English was just about passable. I mean, they couldn't communicate with anybody, so they went from their base in the hills to an outpost, to a checkpoint or something in the city, and back. No idea why they were there. They did nothing of any use. They themselves were appalled, frankly, at the situation. You could multiply this again and again. There are countries from places like Nepal, Sri Lanka, which makes the Haitians laugh. The Sri Lankans are sending peacekeepers, to Haiti. It's a sort of funny situation to be in. You'd also know perhaps that cholera was brought unwittingly, but nevertheless with gross negligence by some of these troops from Nepal, and that Haiti has now suffered a catastrophic cholera outbreak, more cases of cholera in Haiti than the rest of the world combined, 8,000 people dead now, many, many times that infected, major disaster. Almost definitely, Clinton admitted, basically everybody's admitted that the UN brought it, except for the UN itself in an official capacity. And they are now finally, after denying this for years, after stalling on investigations, they're finally coming under significant pressure to do something about it and perhaps to face justice. We'll see. I think that would be very hard to achieve. But there's a very interesting case that's been mounted, a collective suit mounted against the UN about this cholera outbreak. You'll know also in just astonishingly baroque and complex detail, if you read these stories, that the reconstruction money that was raised, and you'll remember unprecedented amounts of money, $3 billion plus raised by from private individuals who donated to the Red Cross or other big agencies at the time of the earthquake, and twice that, or perhaps some people say 3 times that, promised or given by government. So a total of about $9 billion raised or pledged, about 2/3 of which has been dispersed, meaning that it's left a bank account over here and gone to another bank account, and perhaps no records for this available. Maybe half of that has actually been spent. The reason for the delays are themselves kind of interesting. One of the things about this, though, is that it's mind-bogglingly complex to figure out where the money's gone. So another of the subtitles for these stories that I'm telling you about often something like, where's all the money gone? And there was a good film about this that was on PBS last year. And it's very, very hard to find out where it's gone. But a few things are clear. One is that most of the money's gone back to the governments and countries that gave it. This is standard policy, of course, with aid programs. USA boasts about how most of the money that it gives comes back to the US one way or another in the form of contracts or services or personnel. But in the case of Haiti, it's really very impressive. Robert Fatten, who's one of the, I think, the most interesting professors working on Haitian politics, estimated this time last year, and again, one of these kinds of stories, that less than 1% of the money, all that money, has actually gone to real Haitian people, as he said. And I can confirm that in the first, there have been different stages to this, but in the immediate period after the earthquake, there was a period of simple relief operation, right? Trying to save people, trying to get emergency supplies in, trying to get some security in, as they called it. Overwhelming emphasis on security, by the way. Again, we can come back to why that was. And then, almost all the money went through the US Department of Defense. They brought in 22,000 troops, they blanketed Port-au-Prince with soldiers. Why? Because they were terrified that there would be an uprising and that rich people would be threatened by mobs of poor Haitians. Because the police stations were in trouble, the department ministries collapsed, the state was really in a crisis. And the assumption is, because Haiti is so incredibly poor and unequal, that if the state is thrown into crisis, there's going to be a riot and the rich are going to be lynched. That's the perennial fear that you don't hear very much about, but that is always under the surface. In fact, there was there was nothing like that. There was virtually no significant looting to speak of. There's no need for all these troops who wasted their time. Very, very few people were saved. All they did was set up security perimeters in places where rich people tend to live or do their shopping. So at that time, most of the money went simply back to the US. All that full operation was paid for by the donors. And the Haitian government received 1% of all that money, 1%, and that is a very big part of the story of why all of this has gone so badly wrong. Since then, the New York Times reported at the end of December, so a few weeks ago, that up to 10% of the relief money has been going through the Haitian government. That sounds a little bit better. 10%, not exactly great, but better than 1%. Until you read that it says almost all the contracts that are then made by the Haitian government are to foreign contractors, meaning foreign NGOs, companies that work hand in glove with an American partner. So there are a few big Haitian magnates, for example, that run logistics companies that are partnered with a similar company, like in Alabama, or partnered with Bechtel, or partnered with Hallward, or whoever it is, and the money goes that way. So again, of that 10% that's gone through the government, a very small fraction has been spent in the way that you would think of in terms of what we maybe used to think of as public expenditure, actual investment in public state-owned resources like running water or public education or public health facilities. To give an example, the main hospital in the country, the General Hospital in Port-au-Prince, has not been rebuilt. So it's been patched up. They can still do some work there. But 3 years on, it would cost about $70 million, which is a relatively small amount of money in this context. It's been agreed in principle that they should do it, and they simply haven't done it. For a full 9 months or so after the earthquake, they didn't pay the salaries of the staff in the hospital. The nurses, they were sleeping in their cars. All the money was there. They simply couldn't be bothered, basically, to pay people's salaries through this. On the other hand, they have put money together to do one big flashy health construction project through Partners in Health, which is a good NGO, and they've built a nice new teaching hospital, but well away from the disaster zone in Mirabelais, which is comfortably outside the disaster area. And they built a nice new kind of gleaming white teaching hospital there, where there's not maybe necessarily such a huge need for it. It's good to have it, of course. But what they haven't done, for example, is set up the budget for its operating costs. So it was just opened a few weeks ago. Here we go, now it's supposed to get started. It will cost about $12 million a year to run it, and they don't have a budget. So, and there's no clear plan to even make sure that there is a budget for it. So we'll see, but it's worth looking at that. And the big hospital, the one that actually is right in the center of the action, the one that's overwhelmingly used by Haitian people, remains half a ruin. So Again, it's extremely discouraging. Canada, even worse, by the way. Canada, which used to pride itself on being such a saintly country, that's where I'm from, by the way, so I feel authorized here to say something a little bit more frank. Canada basically has given all of its money. It's given about $1 billion so far, which is certainly a big amount for Canada. And it's gone virtually entirely to Canadian NGOs and companies. The ambassador recently said that less than 1% has gone to Haitian NGOs and none to the Haitian government. Okay. Now, that again is just a spectacular figure, I think. And they recently, by the way, suspended aid to the Haitian NGOs. I mean, you see how you get depressed even talking about this kind of thing. Part of the reason is they say, well, we can't give it to the Haitian government because the Haitian government is weak and incompetent. And no doubt, partly that's true. The question is, why is it weak and incompetent? You know, what is the reason for this? And part of the reason is, and you never see it written out, I don't think, in these overviews, is that the state has been attacked relentlessly for 30 years. So a similar neoliberal pattern as elsewhere, but worse in Haiti, because, well, for all kinds of historical reasons. But people have been laid off, the public assets, the public companies, things like publicly owned sugar mills and cement factories and telecommunications and ports and the assets that generated some revenue, they've all been sold off. Telecommunications was the big one that went about 1.5 years ago now, sold to the Vietnamese army as it happens. They've all been sold off, they have no revenue, staff have been laid off, civil service has been cut. Simultaneously a big brain drain, so countries like France, Canada, the US also recruit regularly Haitian engineers, doctors, administrators, so they get sucked off, or they work for NGOs that are now based in Haiti, they come and go, and sooner or later many of these people understandably perhaps leave for Paris or Montreal or New York. I won't even try and describe the process, but it's a very interesting and educational one to look at the official planning for this reconstruction money. So you have, in principle, a pot of about $9 billion. Who's going to spend it? How's it going to be planned, etc.? You might have thought that the idea would be to have some kind of Haitian planning commission, some kind of coordinated national process that would have even maybe some popular input into the process, that would represent people from different sectors, that would be based in a clearly defined ministry of the government and so on, and that would spend a little time, come up with a plan, and then implement the plan, right? Well, that is exactly the opposite of what happened. Instead, there was a thing initially called the Interim Haiti Recovery Commission, run by Bill Clinton, with a few Haitians on the board, all basically businessmen, Chamber of Commerce types, but mainly World Bank officials and Clinton's cronies. Half of the decisions, it was convened in New York, the decisions they made were largely taken in Bill Clinton's house, as far as you can tell. They did nothing decisive. They had total control over it, by the way. Any project more than $10 million had to go through this thing, and there was no properly thought through planning at all. It eventually ran out. It had a mandate for 18 months. When the 18 months were up, the Haitian Parliament refused to extend it, and so it just kind of died. At that point, the new president, Martelly, appointed an advisory board that includes people like former conservative leaders like Spanish Prime Minister Aznar and Uribe from Colombia, and Wycliffe Jean for some reason, and a few other people like that. Recently now, the co-chair has been named as Gregory Moves, who's one of the most conservative businessmen in the country. And this is a hardcore pro-business, no-nonsense group, and they've met, as far as I know, once in New York. I'm not sure if they've met since then. That was September 2011. If you look on their website, they have news articles, and they're all from September 2011. Okay. Maybe they've done something since, I don't know. Finally, a few months ago, again in September, and again in New York, a new Haiti Reconstruction Commission was established. Again, we'll see, I don't know how often it's met or what it does or whether it has any function, but it's supposed to be the planning agency. It's a little, it's very hard to reconstruct this. There's no clear public information for it. What's interesting is if you read the reports of it, and there was a pretty good one by international standards in the New York Times on the 23rd of December by Deborah Sontag. Good article, I recommend that you look at it. But there are blindnesses, and one of them is on this point. She says nobody wanted to work out like this. We wanted it to be a Haitian-led process, as they say. The government, nobody wanted foreigners to take over, but they did. Somehow or other, it just happened. She says they did not mean to. Nobody in the humanitarian world wanted to sharpen Haiti's dependency on foreign assistance. But, and she goes on, it just sort of inevitably, nobody really wanted, but it just happened that way. That takes an immense amount of bad faith to say something like that. This is the result of 30 years of deliberate policy that drove Haiti to this position and has been very, very deliberate, easily reconstructed, and easily predictable consequences. Okay, I'm sure you, like me, are running out of patience for this, but you'd also know, again, if you've been continuing to read these reports, that there's been very little economic recovery, despite some pretty grandiose figures forecast by the IMF. The IMF thought maybe 8-9% economic growth for this year. In fact, it was a little around, it was maybe 2-2.5%, which itself is a kind of meaningless figure for most people. The only thing that's really happened again is creation of the prospect of new light assembly jobs. So this is the big solution. This is again a 30-year-old policy. It started with Jean-Claude Duvalier, so the son of Papa Dog, Baby Dog, who in the 1970s, as the neoliberal project was sort of getting going in Latin America, Haiti's contribution to that was basically to introduce measures that bankrupted peasant and small farmers in the countryside, drove them, the same usual plan, drove them into the cities where they would be available for low-cost jobs, and that worked reasonably well. And over the 1970s, that sector increased so that you had, by the mid-80s, maybe 80,000 or so people making T-shirts and baseballs and US Army uniforms and things like that. But then, the same thing happened everywhere else, of course, and as a result, you have a glut, and nobody really needs that many T-shirts, etc. Now, there's no demonstrable demand for these new jobs that are being created by big T-shirt companies and contractors and so on. But what they can do is move them from somewhere where the wages are a little bit higher. So in the DR, for example, the Dominican Republic, the daily wage is somewhere between $10 and $15 a day. In Haiti, it's a third or a quarter of that. So for a while, at least, it makes sense to move them. It doesn't take much to move the sewing machines and so on, to move them from one country all across the border to another. It's also very useful for the region as a whole to be able to threaten people who might be reckless enough to plan a trade union or something like that with the prospect of moving. So it has a function, even if its immediate prospects are relatively limited. At the moment, again, I'm not aware of a good estimate, but somewhere between 30 and 40,000 people work in the sector in Haiti. The place to look at if you're curious, the big poster project announced with great fanfare by Clinton in the autumn is this new free trade zone industrial park called Caracol on the northeast coast. The US has put most of its money into that. It's something like $124 million. So far, there's one contractor that's moved in, a South Korean garment maker. Okay, you'd also know, and I think I'm going to end with this, on this point, that there's been very little reconstruction. There was an earthquake, a lot of things fell down. You'd have thought a big priority would be to make sure that you rebuilt them and got them back up. But in fact, that's happened to an astonishingly small degree. They just cleared the rubble off the palace. You might have seen pictures of the big white National Palace, which crumpled like a balloon and sat there as a wreck for more than 2 years. It's only recently been cleared away, but there's certainly no clear plan about how to reconstruct it. The cathedral is a wreck, but much more importantly, the houses that went down. So, probably more than 1 million people were made homeless, and really untold numbers of houses were declared unsafe or simply fell down. And if you look at housing policy, and here I'll refer you to some, if you look around for this, there's some really well done, eye-opening, revealing reports about this by groups like Haiti Grassroots Watch. There's a good one a short one by Amnesty International that came out recently, and lots of others around. You know, the big drama was you had about 1 million people then living initially under tents in Haiti. I'm sure you saw the pictures of this. There are still, as we speak, 350,000 people living in tarps in unofficial settlements. Many, as in 3/4 have no access to running water. The conditions are horrible. The mud is terrible. The rain, when it comes, floods these places. There's no security. There's been all kinds of trouble with sexual violence and basically all kinds of problems that you can imagine that would come of this. And that's an improvement. This time last year was about 500,000. So they've made a little bit of progress. But you ask, well, how have they made the progress? What have they done? And of all that money that I put in, how much would you guess? Now we're talking, in principle, $9 billion. Right? How much of it has been spent on building new housing, new, proper, permanent housing that you can live in? and live in for more than a few weeks? Incredibly, 215 million. That's it. 215 million has been spent on permanent housing, in other words, actual housing. The focus has been on, first of all, it was Band-Aids, so tarps. Tarps, they last for, a few months, and then they start to tear and wear out. T-shelters, so temporary shelters, which have a shelf life, if you're lucky, of about 3 years. In a place like Haiti, they're made out of plywood and other cheap materials, and they degrade, and they last maybe 3 years, if you're lucky. And they built about 100,000 of those. They built some tent cities, particularly a big one north of Port-au-Prince, where there's now about 100,000 people squatting or living in tents in this place that's sort of in the middle of the desert. It's called Kohai. There's nothing there, there's no work there, there's no running water properly there. It's entirely dependent on the provision of water from trucks and so on. It's a temporary stopgap measure, but you've done it and now there are people trying to survive there. But the main project that they've done spectacularly is a rental subsidy scheme. And this again would slightly defy belief. The roots of it, I think, were right, and it's talked about in that New York Times article, and I remember when it happened, that after the earthquake, so people don't know what to do. They search around for anywhere where they can rest, right, and pitch a tent or a tarp. And that meant things like golf courses. It meant the public squares in the center of town. It meant anywhere you could find a patch of ground basically that was safe. It meant also, among other things, the parking lot of a guy called Reginald Boulos. Reginald Boulos is a big businessman, very powerful magnate, particularly in the area called Cité Soleil. He's had a lot of power there, and he's been a prominent figure in all kinds of reactionary stuff for the last 20 years. Big plotter against Aristide, for example. It's another whole long story. The gates of his place were broken down like pretty much every other place like it, and people flooded in, and there were about 10,000 or so people living basically on his big parking lot. He has a car dealership. And there's nothing he could do about that initially, but he wanted to get rid of them, of course. So he, after a few months of this, about 6 months after that started, he paid them off. He said, I'll give you a $400 one-off payment if you get lost and get out of my hair. Okay? People said, that's appalling, you're just basically paying them to evict themselves, how can anybody put up with something like this? Well, it's now national policy endorsed by every NGO I can think of. And what it amounts to, there's different schemes. One of them is called the 16-6 scheme. It's basically paying people a one-off payment of $500 to go and find rental accommodation somewhere out of sight. What they want is the big 6 public squares to be cleared so that when journalists and businessmen and potential investors and other pesky people come to Port-au-Prince, they don't see a big crowd of people sleeping in rough tents. So you take your $500, you go and find a rental accommodation somewhere, and you stay quiet. That's the plan. Problem is that $500 doesn't last very long. Rents have been pushed through the roof because of all these NGOs and foreign staff that have flooded in Port-au-Prince. No one can afford a rental accommodation. There is no rental accommodation to speak of. Most of the houses, in any case, are still damaged. People estimate that about 50,000 damaged, in other words, unsafe houses have been re-occupied against the advice of engineers and so on because people have nowhere else to go. And there's no longer-term solution. There isn't really this tradition of renting like this. Once the money's gone, nobody knows what's going to happen. We'll see, but it's too early yet because you can just about string this out for another few months probably. But in practice, many people then have gone to informal settlements or shack dwellings of different kinds here and there where they can perch. So that's it. A grand total of about 5,000 permanent houses have been built. 5,000. I mean, it defies parity, I think. Okay, let's just stop with this. So in the sort of 10 or 12 minutes I've got, what I'd like to emphasize here is that when you read this, first of all, it's very frustrating and harrowing. But the further problem is that when you present the scenario in these terms, basically as a development problem, as a development disaster story that's gone very badly wrong. That's the dominant motif. You can balance it with some heroic exceptions, some people that somehow or other have managed to do something to survive against the odds. You can nuance it with the odd counterexample of something that's gone reasonably well. Partners in Health will probably be the biggest counterexample. But the main story is one of saying, well, it's a big disaster, major problems, the logistics are a nightmare, there's all these different agencies, people are well-meaning, but we simply can't really do it properly, and it's regrettable, but this is how it sort of panned out. That's what you get. It's a sort of tone of, well, a mild amount of self-criticism, but here we are, we've got to soldier on and do our best. This is the problem, of course. The real issue is not about development or about the logistical complications or the inefficiency of the UN or these kinds of things. The fundamental problem is a political one, and it's about Haitian sovereignty and popular power, or rather popular powerlessness. The story in Haiti of the last 30 years is the systematic disempowerment of the people, which has led to a situation like this. And that's the point I want to emphasize. I've written about it for years now, 2004, and then 7, and then 10, and I'm a little reluctant to repeat myself, but basically it is the same old story, I'm afraid. And if you want to read more about it, well, you can track those things down. There's loads more where that came from other people too, of course. But that's the basic thing to understand, is the root problem here is a lack of national sovereignty, a weak government, meaning a weakened government. The government has been decimated, deliberately decimated. It's been weakened through the neoliberal measures that I mentioned, but more importantly by straightforward political interference and violence. Two major coups that had catastrophic consequences that overthrew the only real popular democratic elected governments that Haiti's had in 1991 and 2004, both led by Aristide. And the fallout of all of this, and that is the story. And if we're serious about doing something, we, meaning people outside Haiti, trying to help the situation, it should be about, first and foremost, about helping to re-empower Haiti's own people, strengthen the state that they've got, and minimize foreign interference, particularly from foreign NGOs and some foreign governments, the US, Canada, and France. By the way, parenthetically, some other governments, namely Venezuela, Cuba, to some extent Venezuela, and Ecuador, have been helpful. Cuba in particular, and they are helpful. That's one tiny glimmer of hope you could look at, is that there is a new alignment, as you all know, of power in the region, and it may have more consequences than it's had so far. So far, there's been some subsidized fuel from Chavez, there's been some fantastically useful help from Cuban doctors, and some literacy projects that they've helped to run, sort of Si Yo Puedo program. But it's been pretty patchy and not really enough to make a major difference yet. So basically, to present the story, I think also, rather than focus on Haitian weakness and incompetence, the issue again is more the opposite. It's more that historically the problem has been Haitian strength and Haitian resistance to the dominant configuration of things. And to do this properly, you have to go back to the revolution at the end of the 18th century. I'm not going to try and do that now, but briefly, to take the story up to the last 30 years or so, Haiti was the place, again, that was, the problem was not its poverty, but on the contrary, its wealth. Haiti was the richest colony in the 18th century. It generated more revenue than all of the 13 colonies, for example, in the 18th century. It was the powerhouse of the plantation economy, generated huge amounts of wealth, but they were massively unequal, and that set the story for Haiti's economic development ever since, really. It's always been marked by this grotesque discrepancy between a small elite, plantation elite in the colonial days, a new, more multinational elite these days, but basically a similar distribution of wealth, and then a huge mass of impoverished, more or less powerless people. And that's been challenged twice. It was challenged by the revolution, and it was challenged again by Aristide and the Lavalas mobilization in the 1980s. And the one side develops from the other in a certain way. I'm skirting, of course, across a huge swathe of history here, but the revolution, and I'm sure you know the story, but the only successful slave revolution in history, absolutely fundamental event, of course, in Haitian history and in world history. And it was, the key thing is that it was successful, and it was successful on the participants' own terms. So slaves died in Haiti very, very quickly, on average 4 years life expectancy. That meant that the slaves who fought that revolution, most of them had grown up in Africa. And they had a clear agenda of what they wanted, which was to have an end to plantation slavery, of course, and to have their freedom, the freedom to have their own small plot of land, and to set up their own communities on their own terms. And with some, exceptions and complications, they were largely successful in doing that. The soldiers who won this 13-year brutal war of liberation largely got their own land, were able to set up their own small farms and communities based on small ownership. So and it was strong, it was powerful, it was strong enough to resist the usual tendency towards the building up of latifundia and what Marx would call primitive accumulation, people being driven off the land and so on, as happened in Britain earlier, and as that happened across Latin America, of course. Which meant that you didn't have the development of a big industrial proletariat, you didn't have the development of a group of people who could exploit that proletariat, industrial bourgeoisie, if you like, and it meant that the population remained relatively dispersed across the country in small farms with relatively little capacity to build a national infrastructure, national roads, national economy, etc. And that meant that, so it was successful, but it was also a recipe for creating a relatively easily controlled population. The US Marines could do it with a relatively small expeditionary force in the first part of the 20th century, and then the different dictatorships that were set up in their wake, the most notorious being François Duvalier's, could maintain order with something like a neo-feudal strategy of local sheriffs or paramilitaries, the tonton macoutes, who could terrorize local populations as needed. And at the price of tens of thousands of political deaths or disappearances over the 1950s and 60s, that's what happened through to the early 70s. It changes, and then, so up until then you have a relatively dormant political country. The CIA, by the way, very impressed with the success of this strategy. There's not much of a development of a modern political democratic movement until the Lavalasse mobilizations take shape. And that's a result in part from the neoliberal changes that I mentioned before, so that involves things like removing subsidies for farmers growing rice, for example, which means they can't compete when the US starts dumping their subsidized rice in the country. Farmers go bankrupt, they go into the cities, they scrabble around for a living, they accept these terrible wages, really pennies an hour. But it means the plus side of that, if you want to think of it that way, is that they come together in more and more intensive communities. They develop networks of political solidarity and form quite disciplined local organizations, popular organizations, that become increasingly powerful and very, very difficult to police. So a fundamental story about what happens in Haiti in the 1980s is that the old feudal strategy for pacifying this population with sheriff-style paramilitary intimidation starts to break down. And it breaks down because in the cities, and to some extent also in the countryside, popular networks of people coming together in these poor neighborhoods organize against it. And this is a part of the story that's not, I think, properly understood and properly emphasized. One of the reasons why Aristide and a few other people like Aristide became so popular in the 1980s and really were, it's hard to exaggerate the enthusiasm, were loved, were applauded very powerfully, and still to this day a strong memory associated with that time. And part of the reason is because they encouraged this process of popular self-empowerment, including, crucially, the legitimation, if you like, of defensive violence against the paramilitaries. So Aristide was attacked for this from the beginning by international human rights groups saying he's encouraging mob rule and so on. But it is true, and if you talk to Haitian people and get to know them a little bit and they trust you, they will admit that anybody who lived in that scenario, who lived in the poor neighborhoods, who lived in the countryside where they'd suffered this repression from the Macoutes, will tell you that the fundamental thing that changed is that we were able to defend ourselves. We gained the capacity to stand these guys down and to eventually to uproot them, as they say, the dishucage, the uprooting of the Macoutes, meaning basically a popular counter-offensive against these guys, which took place in the mid-1980s, culminates in 1986, that involved, in some cases, horrible countermeasures, burning tires around people's necks, lynchings of people. Dozens of these Macoutes were killed in retribution and forms of popular vengeance. And Aristide, although he discouraged, of course, the violence, and he regretted the excesses and so on, but he said, if it's a matter of defending yourselves against the paramilitaries, if it's a matter of defending yourself against the army when they come for you, then you are right and you should defend yourselves. And if you don't defend yourselves, you're dead. No one else is going to defend you. There is no police force. There was no army that you could go to defend you. The army was the problem. And that was a defining factor in the 1980s through to the mid-1990s. And still, by the way, under the surface, I think a very important issue, which is who has the power to defend people, if you like? Who does that in a situation where the army has been historically part of the problem, where the police is corrupt, where the police works for the employers, it works for people who have historically been involved in the most horrific human rights abuses, where communities are full of informers and people who are working for the police and so on. So it's a situation a little bit comparable to that of, say, the townships in South Africa in the 1980s and before, and you have a similar recourse in extremists to popular violence with similar tactics. Right? So that was important. I'm going to summarize this by saying that basically what happened in the 1980s is that the old means of pacifying the people broke down, and on three fundamental counts, the Haitian people managed to solve some of the problems that you have to solve if you're going to have a genuine democratic movement. And it's because they solved them that it solicited a backlash to undo the solution, if you like. And it's that undoing of their solution, or what I was trying to describe before as a politics of containing this democratic mobilization, that has really been the driving thing in Haiti and remains so to this day. Now, it's a little bit arbitrary, but the way I break this down across these three, and I'm going to finish in about 5 minutes, these three spheres or dimensions is that, that you need, I think, for pretty much any form of popular mobilization or democratic movement. You need to be able to assemble people. They have to be able to combine, things like trade unions or political parties. They have to find ways of associating, putting their heads together, combining their capacities. If you remain divided and dispersed, of course, you're easily controlled. And that started to happen in Haiti as a result of the measures I mentioned before, people coming together more in the cities. There are rural traditions that are important here as well. There were some new things that developed, again in the cities, particularly through the influence of liberation theology, which was a very important part of this story in Haiti, but not some other places. But don't forget that it was only in Haiti where they elected one of these guys. Aristide was a prominent, important, courageous liberation theologian, and Haiti's the only place where they put a bad guy in power, unless you include Lula. So the development of a small petites églises, they call them, little churches linked to liberation theology, a very important way of organizing people, popular associations of different kinds that had the capacity to defend themselves, as I said, and that had clearly defined leaders, leaders who were respected, who had a relatively common agenda, who had a great deal of prestige, and who, on balance, tended to organize themselves around the head leader, if you like. Aristide became de facto the main spokesman. And spokesperson or spokesman is the right term for this. There are people who, if you ask, there are always local organizations of different kinds in neighborhoods in Haiti, and you can always find someone who, for the moment, has the confidence of people, and they say, well, go talk to her or to him. She's the person who basically speaks for us on this point. And that's how leaders develop. They're the people who, in confrontations or in situations or arguments with the police or the government, emerge as the spokesperson for that group. And that's what some of these liberation theology priests and trade union leaders and so on became. And they had a real platform. They had, in the case of the Catholic Church, they had buildings that you could go into where thousands of people would come in, the cathedral in Port-au-Prince, and you could give a speech with 1,000, 2,000 people listening, who would record it, who would share the message across the country. The cassettes traveled around and so on. So you could get an agenda out. You could have people who would come together around a basic message. Liberation theology is drawing on resources that everybody in Haiti knows. They know the basic message. You have, in every parish of the country, you have a building, a place to meet, you have resources. This is a fundamental thing. The Catholic Church in Haiti, like elsewhere, had been very conservative, and it really is turned on its head and becomes a vehicle for very progressive forces in the 1970s and early 80s. So you have that. You have the capacity to assemble, to associate, and in particular you have, and it takes a while, and it's torturous, and it's uneven, and so on, but you have the development of a political party as well, called Famille Lavalas, which takes shape in the 1990s, and after some, again, a laborious process, it wins slowly but surely the capacity to win elections and to have a national mandate in every part of the country, and in particular in the parliament. This took a long time. It didn't exist before. It started in 1996, wins its first elections in 97, and in 2000 you have elections across the board, both houses of parliament, as well as the presidency, every municipal government as well. And on balance, they win 70 to 75% of the vote. which translates, without a first past the post system, it translates into a kind of 90+% majority in Parliament. So they have a major mandate, 2000, okay, very important turning point in all of this. So you have that capacity to organize, to assemble, to associate, to combine, and to have organizations that can represent that collective power. There's also the power you need, that's the first thing. The second thing is you need the power for people to be able to participate in these things, to discuss, to deliberate, to have information about what should be done, to share ideas, to criticize, etc. And for some of the same kinds of reasons, this also develops in the 1970s and 80s through literacy programs that the Lavalas governments pushed through when they were elected in 1990 and then again in 2000. New radio programs, so there's a big explosion of popular radio programs in the 1980s and 90s. Some of them are run by children, for example. They're really really remarkably innovative. And they allow for really the first time of mass participation in the public discussion. Again, quite an important part of the story. And third, in a way most important, a capacity to implement the decisions that are taken collectively. So Famille Lavalas is a party, for example. Again, it's imperfect, but it has a network all across the country of gathering ideas and suggestions. They put together a national program. It then wins an election, and it starts to implement the program. Okay? The question is, can you implement it in the face of resistance? Can you collect taxes from the rich, from corporations? Can you appropriate land so that you can then redistribute it? Can you undertake these measures, which are relatively moderate, as it turns out, but that nevertheless encounter resistance? And the big question there is who has the guns, basically, to push issues through when they get sticky. And again, the single most important thing that happened, I think, in this period, in the 1990s, is that the army, which has historically always controlled the country and intervened when necessary, was prevented finally from doing so. So I'm sure you'll remember this history, and if not, it's again a bit too complicated to summarize here. But Lavalas is elected, first of all, or RC is elected at least as a president in 1990. The army, though, is still in place. The army had always been the power broker, represents the status quo, more or less. And they're unhappy with him. They overthrow him. I think it's coup number 31 or something in the history of the country. And they throw him out, and they kill, hundreds of people the first night, thousands more people over the next few years. And by 1994, the popular movement is in terrible shape. Internal exile is caught, thousands of people have had to flee their homes, organizations are shattered, and Aristide has been spending 3 years by that stage negotiating fruitlessly with the United States, trying to allow him to come back. And it's an utterly galling story. It really, again, defies description. But eventually, the situation gets so out of hand, and so disastrous and counterproductive that the US finally accepts to do it. They have other reasons also for wanting to do this. They tie Aristide's hands with various compromises that he makes, rightly or wrongly. This is very hotly debated. But it at least allows him to go back in the company of the US Marines, who invaded in the autumn of 1994. And the key thing that allows him to do is to get rid of the Haitian army. So within a few months, he eliminates the Haitian army, and that creates a totally new situation. You now have the possibility, although he's made compromises, although Famille Lavalas is an imperfect organization, but really for the first time in Haitian history, it's possible now that a national organization with a credible leader, with a clearly defined program, with a genuine grassroots organization, such as it is, to get elected, to have a program, and to be able to implement it without some extra political military mechanism getting in the way and stopping them from doing it. So, and that happens in 2000. When they win that election, Aristide, but you can't have consecutive terms, so Aristide agrees to leave, even though he's been in exile for 3 years. He agrees to treat those 3 years of exile, in which everything he did was undone, all these people killed and so on. He agreed to say, okay, let's treat them as if they were part of my term. He resigns then, leaves office in 1995. He comes back though in 2000. And the defining story of Haiti since then is how this movement, which now had a capacity to act, had a party, had got rid of the army that was always the problem. What happened to them after 2000? And I encourage you to try and find out about that. I wrote about it at length. There's other accounts on the web, but basically, what you can kind of guess is that on the 3 points that I mentioned, associating and deliberating and organizing, informing and finding out, implementing decisions and defending yourself, on each of those scores they've been reversed. It's been undone. The organization has been destroyed. Famille Lavalas has been prevented simply from participating in elections. They were unable to field a candidate. This is an organization that, again, however imperfect, would have easily won any new election. They simply were blocked by the United Nations in the most outrageous violation of international law from putting a candidate in the last couple of elections. The organization has been further splintered, and people have been bought off, and all kinds of terrible infighting and subversion of different kinds. The capacity to form these big popular demonstrations, which have been the main urban form of mobilizing people, has been infiltrated to an extraordinary degree. Now, any journalist who goes to Port-au-Prince you can talk to people who covertly will tell you that you can basically rent a mobilization if you have the money and know the right people. It's been extremely demoralizing and confusing. In terms of information and deliberation, the profusion of NGOs, the privatization of most of those radio stations I meant, they're turning in the monopoly now to a large extent of the media by for-profit, mostly reactionary organizations that are grouped in a very solidly right-wing coalition has made it very difficult to get information out. The use of NGOs to complicate and fragment policymaking has been really very counterproductive. And finally, when it comes to implementing decisions, the move to get rid of the army, which was really the single key achievement of the mid-1990s. And what happened? Well, there's a coup in 2004. RC was simply chucked out of office. Again, an outrageous story that's very little known. And why is there a UN? I asked at the beginning, why is the UN in Haiti? Well, they're there to police the coup of 2004. The Americans simply went in, they plucked Aristide out, they helped mobilize a paramilitary insurgency which put pressure on him from the northern part of the country. And they went into his house in the middle of the night and they took him out. And they flew him, lying through their teeth at every stage. They flew him to the Central African Republic, which is a very curious place to take Aristide. Kept him there for as long as they needed to. And then used the occasion, of course there was disturbances after that, to justify a full-on invasion and replace that invasion force with the UN a few months later in June 2004. And the UN's been there ever since to police the population, to pacify the population, and to maintain the coup. That's the project, that's what they're doing, that's what they're still doing. And undercover, so in other words, RC got rid of a Haitian army, enabled a political process to start, enabled popular participation, and the UN has gone in and replaced it with a foreign army. So you now have this foreign army, and under the cover of that foreign army, what's now happening is finally plans for the re-establishment of a Haitian army. This has been Martelly, the new president's one of his big plans, big campaign promises that he would re-establish a Haitian army. He announced it again in August 2011, and he's been working on it ever since, but he's running into some logistical problems. Trying to figure out how best to do it, but that's certainly on the cards, and that isn't, no doubt, what will happen in the coming days. So there we are. The situations then you have is really pretty hard to describe. It's bad to end on such a negative note, but it's precisely because there was a powerful popular mobilization in Haiti. There was a genuine grassroots movement, and there was one at a very difficult time. Remember, the late 1980s, the Sandinistas have been pushed out and subverted. Chavez and company are not yet on the horizon. RC was very isolated. It was a very difficult time to put together a project like this. And it's been under severe, direct, forceful military pressure ever since. And the fallout is what we have now. Utterly despondent. The people that I'm in touch with who are often veteran militants of this are in total despair. They say they can never remember a situation that's as bad as this. About a third of the people that I interviewed in 2006-07 are missing or dead or have been killed or committed suicide. I mean, it is a catastrophic situation, truly. And it will only change not because the UN gets its act together, not because NGOs are a little bit better at dispersing their programs or coordinating their programs, but if there is something like a revolution in Haiti, I would say, that involved a major transfer of power from this fragmented international intervention to something like a grassroots popular sovereign movement.